Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nico Israel, and I'm professor of English at Hunter and a co-director of Hunter's Mellon Public Humanities Scholars Program. The interdisciplinary field of public humanities deploys humanistic inquiry's important modes of analysis and discovery to address publics outside the university. It helps foster what Judith Butler has called an alternative vision of the humanities and the university, one that the Mellon Foundation has endorsed, and one that I hope other funders and educational institutions will increasingly come to value and support, end quote. Butler has cited Hunter College's Mellon Public Humanities program in particular as a model for this alternative vision, and we're very grateful for that acknowledgement. If you haven't already done so, please have a look at our webpage and check out the projects of our 24 brilliant socially engaged current scholars who will be wrapping up their fellowships this month. These students have been exploring a range of issues with global, national, and local scope. A reimagining of New York City policing with lessons from Northern Ireland, the pernicious effects of the Asian model minority myth, a study of art museums as a mental health resource, the links between 1960s jazz music and the civil rights movement, Latinx art and its place in the New York City art world, the development of Islamic feminism, and the history of labor activism in New York's Yiddish-speaking Jewish communities in the early 20th century. For their public outreach projects, our scholars are working with formerly incarcerated people, with educators of the vision impaired, with queer dance collectives, and with local city government agencies. In the last few weeks, they have been organizing panels, producing films, podcasts, and Wikipedia pages, and sharing their work and their ideas widely. Symposia in which they document this work will take place beginning at the end of this month. During the next academic year, we will be welcoming 29 students into the program, and many of those students are attending today. We're glad to have you join us. Today's is the second of 3 roundtables in the conference called Public Humanities and the Democratic Commons. The speakers at our first roundtable last week addressed the broader question of the Democratic Commons, a rubric that provides a different way of thinking about the public sphere. Our speakers both embraced the possibilities of the idea of the commons and demonstrated some of its inheritances and conceptual impasses. Next Friday's speakers will discuss the important and sometimes contentious question of monuments in public commemoration, and we hope all of you will register for and attend that roundtable as well. Today's roundtable is titled Print, Podcast, Social, Public Humanities and Popular Media. It will involve a discussion about the different venues of popular media, from daily newspapers and broadcast news to digital spaces, including podcasting, Twitter, and Instagram. Its participants, 5 highly regarded scholars who are also media practitioners, will address recent directions in the study of so-called new and old media, as well as discussing the implications of the consumption of mediated information. This event would not be possible were it not for the generous support of the Mellon Foundation and of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb. Thanks are also due to Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer and staff members Magda Mazurik-Nuovo, Danny Culkin, and Katrina Avila for their facilitation of these events. I'd also like to acknowledge our principal investigator, Dr. Jonathan Fountain, for all he has done for our program since its inception over 2 years ago. MPH co-director, Linda Martin Alkoff, and our indispensable program administrator, Arden Armbruster. I would now like to introduce Professor Philip Ewell, who will in turn introduce our first speaker. Phil is an associate professor of music at Hunter and at the CUNY Graduate Center, whose specialties include Russian music and music theory, 20th century music, 20th century modal theory, and rap and hip hop. His recent research has focused on Russian interpretations of modernist composers such as Igor Stravinsky and Anton Webern. Phil is on the faculty committee that helped conceive and shape our program, and he and other colleagues on the committee are to be acknowledged as important co-organizers of this 3-week conference. So thank you, Phil, and please take it away.
Nico, thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, my name is Philip Ewell, and I'm coming to you from Brooklyn here, and I'm really excited to moderate this discussion today. I'm going to do really brief introductions, and each of our 5 speakers are going to have about 10 minutes to talk about some of their work and ideas. Just to let you know, after that, somewhere near the top of the hour, 2 o'clock, a little bit after, we, the 6 of us, will engage in a discussion among ourselves. And then roughly about 2:30, 2:35, we're going to open it up to all of you, the participants, for questions. With that said, there is a Q&A box on the Zoom gallery, as I'm sure you all know, since we've done this for so long now. So please feel free at any moment to ask questions in there, and hopefully we will get to them at the end, the roughly half hour that we'll have, maybe a little bit less, for general Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to do really brief introductions for each of our guests, which will appear, who will appear in alphabetical order by last name. And that means John Biewen is up first. John Biewen is audio program director at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. He teaches there, and he has a podcast called Scene on Radio. This was transformational for me. A friend of mine back in Illinois said, Phil, you've got to listen to this. You've got to listen to this, a few years back. And I'm like, Steve, leave me alone. And I finally did. And I think maybe it was 14 episodes. I can't quite remember, but by golly, it was transformative. It was really well done. And it really kind of brought me into a world of public media that I really hadn't thought much of as an outlet for these types of talks, these deep dives into events. So I won't talk anymore, and I'm going to invite John. Thank you very much, John, for being here. It's so great to meet you.
Thank you. Likewise, and I appreciate that very gracious introduction. It's really good to be here with you. I'm honored to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. So, as you said, I am a podcaster, which, you know, is a little bit, these days, it's a little bit like saying I'm a person, or at least, especially a white male American person. Yes, I have a podcast. I am one of the subset of podcast makers who has, you know, long been working in audio journalism, audio documentary. When I was 22, I stumbled out of a liberal arts college in Minnesota into public radio, worked for Minnesota Public Radio for years, for NPR News in the late 90s, covering the Rocky Mountain West, worked for 8 years for something called American Radio Works, which produced documentary specials for the public radio system. And I've been at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke since 2005 or 6. Although, and I do teach, as you mentioned, although it's still been part of my job to make documentary audio for years. That meant producing projects for public radio programs or distribution to stations. And now since 2005, I've been making this podcast, Scene on Radio, through the Center for Documentary Studies. And I'm going to share my screen. I've got just a few slides. Okay, so I'm not a scholar, right? And I always say I'm a journalist, you know, / documentarian, so I'm not an expert on anything except maybe how to make an audio documentary, and I do teach courses on that at Duke. But in my media work, in my primary work, now primarily this podcast, I learn stuff from people who are experts and scholars, and I synthesize and present what I've learned for a broader audience, right? What journalists and documentarians do. For a long time, going back to my public radio days, I've been interested in history and historical documentary, usually in those days, recent 20th century US history. So I'd made documentaries for public radio about the Korean and Vietnam Wars, about Freedom Summer, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the women who founded the modern hospice movement. So I did not see this coming, but it has turned out that a shift to podcasting has plunged me into the humanities in a way that, in a new way and in a new kind of depth. History in particular, but also drawing on other kinds of scholarship, philosophy at times, anthropology. And I could not be happier about this. I'm absolutely grateful and thrilled. When I say I didn't see it coming, I'm alluding to really the podcast series. So back in the old days, 10 or 15 years ago, when the universe for audio documentary in this country pretty much consisted of what you could do or what you could hear on public radio, I thought that I had a dream job when I got to make, 1 hour specials, that is single 53-minute programs on a subject. On the NPR news magazines, as we all know, I imagine most people here are familiar with what NPR does. Things were much more constrained than that, right? In the 90s, All Things Considered routinely ran 20-minute documentaries, and on the weekend shows, you could occasionally get a 10 or 15-minute piece on the air into the 2000s, but those things don't happen anymore. The wisdom in the corner offices of the public radio world, like in much of society, was that nobody wanted long form journalism or documentary. Nobody has an attention span longer than 3 or 4 minutes, least of all anyone under 40 years old. That's the future, get over it. Well, it turns out that was wrong, spectacularly wrong, in my opinion, and I'm grateful for that. A couple years ago, the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard asked me to write a short piece on whatever I saw as an important trend in media for the coming year. I chose to focus on the emergence of the podcast series, right? Think about it, 8, 10, 14 parts, a bunch of hours in total, the audio nonfiction and sometimes fiction equivalent of a good book. Or you could say a kind of analog to the bingeable Netflix, etc. series that so many of us are burning through. Some of those are documentary as well, right? And that's become a new kind of venue for documentary work, including work that delves into the humanities. Podcast listeners, who in fact skew younger than in most other media, certainly compared to public broadcasting, seem to be saying, yes, thank you. Take me on a journey. We're going to take our time, get into the weeds, really learn some stuff. Sign me up. My first foray into producing a podcast series was in 2017, the series that Phil mentioned on Scene on Radio called Seeing White. It's a 14-part series exploring the history and construction of whiteness, the whole idea that there's a group of humans we're going to call white. Who made up this story? What does it mean? What is it for? How has it functioned in the world, and how is it shaping our lives now? With the help of my series collaborator, Chenjerai Kumanyika, a Rutgers media scholar, and a bunch of brilliant academic historians. So including folks like Nell Irvin Painter, author of The History of White People, folks like Shannon Sullivan, Robin's colleague, who's at the UNC Charlotte, a philosopher, and Ibram X. Kendi, the now quite famous historian who's at Boston University. To give you a quick taste, I'm going to play just one 90-second clip. This is from the second episode of Seeing White. The episode was called How Race Was Made. And here, Ibram Kendi is talking about what he believes to be the first written expression of racist ideas. The notion that just this very notion that large masses of humanity belong in different groupings or categories, and crucially that those so-called races constitute a hierarchy, which was the very purpose for creating race in the first place, of course. That idea had not been thought up before the 15th century. And Kendi blames this guy, the guy highlighted in the middle on this monument in Lisbon. His name is Gomes de Zurara. Portuguese guy, and he wrote a book in the 1450s extolling the accomplishments of the guy at the top of that monument, Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry essentially pioneered the African slave trade in Europe in the 1440s, starting in the 1440s. Slavery, of course, was widespread in the ancient world, but it wasn't racialized in any consistent way. It was about the spoils of war or caste-like systems. People often enslaved people who looked like them. That was about to change in Europe. Ibram Kendi is talking about what Zurara did in his writings.
And so I basically make the case that he was the first articulator of racist ideas. And in order for him to articulate racist ideas, he had to basically combine all of the different ethnic groups that Prince Henry was enslaving into one people, and then describing that people as inferior. And so presumably then though he did not necessarily speak as much about whiteness, he certainly created blackness. And blackness, of course, cannot really operate without whiteness.
And to Kendi, this is crucial. Zurara was not just some independent chronicler calling them as he saw them. As I said before, he was hired to write the book by the Portuguese king, Prince Henry's nephew.
Zurara was also a member of the Military Order of Christ, which was like this para sort of military/Christian organization, similar to like the Knights of Templar, and who was the leader of the Military Order of Christ? Prince Henry. And when Prince Henry said something, you were a member, you did it, including make him look good for slave trading.
So it's fair to say literally that slave traders commissioned the invention of this sort of codified racist idea of black people, and implicitly then, on the other hand, of white people.
Yes.
The Seeing White series has now been downloaded something like 6 million times. And it's been used in dozens, maybe hundreds of classrooms from university to middle school, like community and faith-based discussion groups and corporate diversity and equity programs. When I say I didn't see this coming, I didn't see this coming. Based on the response to Seeing White, it became clear to me that this is what we're going to do with Scene on Radio, not one-off episodes, but season-long explorations into deeper questions that could be summarized as really, who are we really, and how did we get this way? So we followed in 2018 with a 12-part series called Men, which explored the history of patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, masculinity, and our 2020 series on the history of what passes for democracy in the US, the land that never has been yet. In each of these series, we range back hundreds and even thousands of years with the help of historians, anthropologists, philosophers. So just to sum up, podcasting, I think the prevailing image is that it's primarily a place where people, especially bros, sit behind microphones and hear themselves talk. And it is that, but it's also become a place where a kind of public humanities can flourish. There are other history podcasts that are equally popular and more popular than Scene on Radio. There are podcasts devoted to literature, poetry, music of every kind, music theory, philosophy, art history. My hope through this work is to contribute to a broader process of education and, if you like, reckoning that I think is happening in our society at this time. Maybe not with the swiftness that we would wish for, but it is happening, I believe, to give people information and tools and understanding, really to help us figure out together who we want to be and how we need to change to get there. Thanks for listening. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panel members.
John, thank you so much. That was great. Just a quick note here. You did say, quote, "I'm not a scholar," unquote. And I would have to push back on that a little bit. Alex Ross also mentioned to me in an email once that literally he said the same thing. The music critic for the New Yorker, for those who might not know. I'm not a scholar. And I just thought, well, if John Biewen and Alex Ross are not scholars, then what the hell am I? Okay,
Oh,
so please, you are most certainly a scholar and most welcome to take part in any scholarly conversation that I might be having, for example. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pivot now to Jessie Daniels. And as she unmutes and gets ready to join us, Jessie Daniels is a faculty associate at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center, professor of sociology at Hunter College, and affiliate faculty of Africana Studies, critical psychology, and sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. Jessie is a dear friend of mine since we both teach at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. And not only is she a dear friend of mine, she is a former mentor of mine. I was very happy to be menteed with Jessie a few years back in a program for mid-career scholars at CUNY. And if anybody knows the work that I did with music theory on white racial framing, that's Jessie. Jessie said to me 3 years ago, roughly 4 years, who knows? She said, Phil, you know, I think the work you're doing on this would really work well with Joe Fagan's work on white racial framing. Check it out. So there you have it. I owe a lot to Jessie Daniels, and I'm really happy that she's with us here today. So I'll let her take it away. Let's welcome Jessie. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil. I'm thrilled to be here. I feel in some ways like an honorary representative for the public humanities. I'm in sociology that often jumps the line back and forth between social science and humanities. So I'm delighted to be here. And I want to thank John for that wonderful presentation. I'm one of those 6 million people that downloaded Seeing White. It's a wonderful podcast series. I recommend it to everybody and to my students as often as I can. So it's really a thrill to be here. Phil started out with my introduction saying that, mentioning the work of Joe Fagan. And I think in a lot of ways, Joe Fagan is the place that I have to start my conversation about how I became a public scholar. I had the good fortune to work with Joe at the University of Texas at Austin, where I was a graduate student and for a while his research assistant. And when I finished at UT Austin, I once again had the good fortune to work with Patricia Hill Collins in a postdoc at the University of Cincinnati. And both Joe and Pat are tremendous role models for me and were tremendous guides really in public scholarship. Pat Collins has actually written a book about public scholarship. Joe has been doing public scholarship for a long time. In conversation with Joe in about 2005, Joe and I started talking about creating a blog. It was 2005, which most of you are probably too young to remember, but 2005 was the year that Merriam-Webster declared that blog was the word of the year. And Joe and I started emailing back and forth, and Joe's, now no longer my dissertations advisor, but a great friend. And he would just email me things all the time and have these great ideas about what was going on in the news. And we had this correspondence. And part of the idea with creating the blog that we eventually set up 2 years after blog was the word of the year, is called Racism Review. And we started that in 2007. And part of the idea with that was to take our conversations that we were having about what was happening in the news that we thought maybe people were not paying attention to in the right kind of way, to give those conversations a sort of public viewing and bring more people into that conversation. So we started that blog in, as I said, in 2007. The first story that we did, the first blog post that we did was about Don Imus saying racist things, racist, sexist things about the basketball team at Rutgers. And for a while there, I was really doing a blog post a day. And that hasn't been the case for a while now, but I just want to back up and talk a little bit about my work and how that has sort of led me into more public scholarship and sort of how I see that fitting in. So when I was at University of Texas at Austin, I did a dissertation about white supremacy. I was looking at the printed publications of Klan groups, assortment of white supremacist groups. I had gone to the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama to get a trove of these documents to analyze. And it was on the postdoc with Pat Collins that I turned that into my first book, which is called White Lies. Time passed, I got a regular academic job, and that was in the mid 90s. And it was also about the same time, if you know the internet history, 1994 was the year that Netscape released the Mosaic browser. And what that meant for me and my trajectory was I really felt like it shifted the world in a kind of way. Not everybody saw that. Certainly a lot of people in my field of sociology didn't see that as a big game changer. But there were a few of us that were going, you know what, I think this is a big shift. So before 94, when you went to when you wanted to use the internet, we had to go to a basement room at UT Austin to log on to the internet. And what happened with the 1994 release of the Mosaic browser is it meant that everybody could log on to the internet, everybody. And that also included white supremacists. So I started paying attention in those early days to what white supremacists were doing on the internet. Time passed, long other story, I ended up leaving that early faculty job that I got, and I went to work in the .com industry and had a great time. It was great fun. And eventually that early .com bubble burst and I came back into academia. And trust me, that is the very shortest version of that story. We could do the longer version in person sometime if you'd like. And part of what had happened between when I wrote that early book, looking at these printed documents of white supremacists, and when I was coming back into academia, is that white supremacists had pretty much wholesale moved onto the internet. So I wanted to do a follow-up study and look at how these groups that I looked at in print had transitioned or not onto the internet. And what I found, and that book came out in 2009, it's called Cyber Racism. And what I found is that now they had a much more pernicious presence on the internet, and that we were all in trouble in a way because they were moving onto the internet, and that had lots of ramifications for the rest of us. So what ended up happening with my career is that I had this kind of natural experiment, a kind of accidental natural experiment of looking at white supremacy on either side of the rise of the popular internet. So White Lies came out in 97, Cyber Racism came out in 2009. And in between there, we see this rise when everybody started getting on the internet, right? In the early days, it was sort of like today, if I told you I have in my spare time, I'm a ham radio operator. It's like, oh, how nice for you. And people, I literally had someone tell me, why would you study the internet? It's a fad, Jesse. But I really thought it was going to change things and change the world as we knew it, the social world as we knew it, and how we understood it. So that was really how I got interested in it. And the work on white supremacists sort of led me to this other area of sort of looking at how the internet and all these digital media technologies are changing the social world as we experience it. And so that led to a lot of other work that I've done, really looking at technology and how it's changing our jobs as academics, as professors. The work that we do as scholars is really changing. We no longer go to brick and mortar libraries that often and look at card catalogs. Some of you may not even know what I'm speaking of when I say the words card catalogs, but it was really different when I was in graduate school, and that wasn't that terribly long ago. And I don't think any of us would go back, even though there are these real pitfalls with the world that we now find ourselves in, the digital world, if you will. I think that one of the most important things that John mentioned in his remarks, that we're at this moment of a kind of reckoning, and I really believe that that's true. And I think that there is a way in which people who are scholars, who have the privilege of all the training and paid all that money to read all those books, like we have an obligation to turn around and not only give back, but to speak to a broader public than just the 12 or 20 or, if we're lucky, 150 peers who read our work in academic journals. I'll just close by saying this about what it means to be a public scholar. doing, what I've heard some people call high risk research. And I don't know that I would call my work necessarily high risk, but it does come with a cost. And part of that cost has to do with being public. In the fall of 2017, so this is 10 years after I started the blog with Joe, I said some things on Twitter which were very sociology 101. I was really talking about the wealth gap and the racial wealth gap, when there's a difference in wealth between white families and Black families. And a lot of that has to do with white families passing on their wealth to their children. That got twisted out of context and turned into, this professor at CUNY whose tax dollars supporting, she's advocating for white genocide. And the far right sort of went nuts with that. And they came not only for me, but they came for people in my department. They came for people at Hunter College. People, I felt worst about the two women who were the admin assistants in sociology at the time. And they started getting nasty phone calls, and they didn't even really know what kind of work I did. And that was not fair to them and not called for. So I think, just really quickly, it doesn't really matter if you have a digital media presence at all, social media presence at all. The far right and other bad actors are really coming for people who are public scholars, and our institutions are way before the beginning of trying to figure out how to respond when those attacks happen. So I'm going to stop there and just once again thank Phil so much for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards.
Jesse, thanks so much. That was great. And yes, the whole ecosystem of alt-right forces, kind of that vortex of cancel culture, and they have come after me too for recent work. And as you know, from some of the media stuff, and maybe we can get into a little bit of that in our discussion afterward. Thank you.
Great.
So we're going to move on, and now I'm going to invite Robin James to show up on the screen. And hi, Robin. It's great to meet you finally. So I'm reading like the first sentence of everybody's bio. Robin James is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and co-editor of the Journal of Popular Music Studies. Now, Robin first came onto my radar some years ago because I'm a music theorist and Robin is a philosopher. But years ago, I came across this blog that she'd written, "What can we learn about philosophy's diversity problems by comparing ourselves to music theory?" And I'm like, oh, this is something I have to read. And so ever since that was, I think maybe 2014, I have it here on my other screen, I've been, Robin's been on my radar, and I've been a big fan of her writings and her work. So it's great to meet you finally, and thanks for being here. So I'll see you on the other side.
Great. Thanks, Phil. And thanks for organizing this. Thanks to Matthew, and thanks to Arden for your work behind the scenes, making this all happen. It's an honor to be here with people who I've either met virtually or in person before. It's a great crowd of people, and I'm honored to speak with you. So I am a philosopher who works primarily in popular music studies. So in some ways, I am between two disciplines and fully in neither. And that, I think, the reason I have a career these days is because of the public scholarship I've done, because of the blogging that I'll talk about, right? I think public scholarship has allowed me to find an audience that crosses disciplines, doesn't care about discipline, and not sort of be, it's allowed me as a scholar to not be tethered to, as Phil's discussion of that blog post suggested, two of the most conservative disciplines in the humanities. So I began blogging in 2009, which was about my third year on the tenure track. And this was the era of music blogs. That's blogs where the discourse was happening about popular music. And I was really inspired by Mark Fisher's K-Punk blog, right? So he's a British philosopher who at the time was writing a lot about dubstep. So I was like, well, if he's doing that, I can do it. So the blogging led to my first freelance writing commission at the New Inquiry in 2012. And since then, I've had an active side hustle as a freelance writer for the popular press. And like Jesse, I've been around Twitter for a long time and definitely qualify as an extremely online academic. But back in the late aughts and early to mid 2010s, when online academic discourse still sort of revolved mainly around blogs, the women philosophers who blogged, such as myself, Lee Johnson and Adriel Trott, for example, had lots of conversations about how being a woman online was basically just like being a woman in philosophy. I often tell people that I learned about all the basic Twitter troll moves like sea lioning, which is defined as the repeated and relentless questioning, oftentimes after the question has been explained in detail multiple times, from having read Plato's Socratic dialogues. My pinned tweet, which you can find at Dr. J on Twitter, details Barbara Freeman's encounter with a questioner at the 1985 meeting of the Society for Phenomenological and Existential Philosophy, who responded to her paper on feminist philosophy with a question, what does this have to do with Hegel? Right? That's now known as whataboutism. So for me, being an academic sort of online in the public was not that different from being an academic generally. And while we're on the subject of public scholarships, similarity to traditional scholarship, I just want to note that not all public scholarship is progressive or unorthodox, especially in the field of philosophy. Many of our most prominent public figures, especially in the UK, are noted for their reactionary views. From Roger Scruton to a few living philosophers who I will not dignify by naming here, there are no small number of public philosophers who make their careers from transphobia, Islamophobia, and the targeted harassment of junior scholars and students, and so on. So in my experience, when academics move online, we take all of our baggage with us, and that's not always a good thing. So that's kind of what it's like being a public philosopher. But like I said, I'm sort of between philosophy and popular music studies. And in popular music studies, public scholarship is less a matter of academics moving into online spaces and more about a really porous boundary between academic and public scholarship. I frequently cite and teach the work of people without academic backgrounds, such as Sasha Geffen, Liz Pelly, Britt Julius, and Doreen St. Felix. Many academics have side hustles like mine, where we write for the mainstream music press, and many, such as my JPMS colleague Eric Weisbard, came to academia from music journalism. And there are numerous institutional contexts, such as PopCon, which is happening next week, the pop music conference where academics and extra academic critics present work and mingle, and publications such as the Oxford Handbook of Electronic Dance Music, which I am co-editing with Luis Manuel Garcia, which feature authors both from within and outside the academy. Similarly, there are media platforms such as Switched on Pop and Adam Neely's YouTube channel, which bring musicians, industry figures, and academics together to talk about pop songs and issues in pop music generally. Popular music studies scholars inside and outside the academy are united by more than our interest in the same subject matter. Both our industries are currently being decimated by austerity. In 2020, there were an estimated 30,000 layoffs across media. Similarly, as a recent Truth Out headline put it, colleges are using COVID as a pretext to make draconian cuts to the humanities. A member of my grad school cohort just lost his position in the Laurentian University cuts last week. So, right, this is really, I think, something that is worsening in academia. So in the absence of full-time jobs, people who research and write about popular music, like journalists and academics generally, have to quote unquote be entrepreneurial and find ways of supporting themselves in their work through their own private responsibility. For example, I started out blogging. I understood myself as a public employee paid to research by the people of North Carolina. And due to that support, which I was extremely fortunate to have given the realities of the academic job market, even in 2009, I could put my research out on the internet free of charge. But this past year, I moved my blog to a paid Substack newsletter because my department's operating budget was cut entirely, leaving me to pay for things I need to do my job out of my own pocket, effectively giving me a backdoor pay cut. And since I haven't had a raise in recent memory, my income from my side hustle has become a substitute for that. So, and let me emphasize again, I'm one of the lucky ones who has a full-time tenured gig. I offer my experience as an example to show how even those of us who are, at least in theory, full-time state employees are actually having to replace funds formerly supplied by the state with privately raised ones. And if we can't replace them, we have to privately assume those costs in the form of pay cuts. So when we talk about public humanities scholarship, public often means public facing. Today, however, I would like to reframe public as public supported, whether through taxpayer support of public universities or through advertising and subscription support for publications. What does it mean to call for public engagement from scholars who themselves do not receive adequate public, in the sense of like publicly supported jobs at universities, support for their work? Is this a way for institutions to boost their impact and brand while making individual scholars privately responsible for the costs of those value adds? Given what we know about the gendered and racialized dimensions of private responsibility as a narrative and as a practice, how do demands for public-facing but privately bootstrapped scholarship reinforce systemic inequalities? And how can academics build solidarity with our colleagues in the media and journalism industries who are facing the same sort of industry collapse that we are? So this is just, kind of my experience of being a public writer, author, blogger over the last, I guess, little more than 10 years, right? Austerity has decimated both of the sort of the academic venues for my work and the non-academic venues for my work. And I really think one of the questions public scholars need to be seriously thinking about is how we build solidarities with others in media industries outside the academy to push back against austerity in both industries and to build venues, networks, communities that can really genuinely support public work in the humanities. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was great. Thank you. That was
Thanks.
really excellent to try to think about reaching out to, well, you just mentioned Adam Neely there. And of course, you might know that I was on one of his YouTube videos, and that really just opened up such an interesting world because I very much come from that traditional kind of background. Music theory, as you know, is very much, print. They're still thinking in terms of print publications, even though the print publications are online, all of the structures and the editing and the peer review is still very much with that in mind.
Yeah.
And it's really neat to kind of see what's going on, what else is happening out there. And you're such a great speaker for that. Okay,
Thanks.
so if you can then mute and go away and just for a little bit, and then I'm gonna ask Imani Mosley to join us. And hi, and here is your brief introduction. Imani Danielle Mosley is an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Florida. So I'm not reading the full bios. I'm just trying to save a little time. And I'll just say, I think maybe the most important thing about Imani is that she's a bassoon player. Now I'm a cellist and we have this kinship, cellist, but we read the same bass, tenor, and treble. We're probably like the coolest strings and the coolest woodwinds. So let's just have a group nod about that. And I'm going to let Imani tell you about her public scholarship, which is really, really fascinating too, from the musicological angle. So take it away, Imani.
Thank you so much, Phil. Yeah, I definitely would have to agree that is maybe one of the better things about me. And thank you so much for that introduction and for organizing us all here together, Matthew and Arden, all of your work. Doing this, I'm noticing a lot of overlap as people are talking, which is really exciting. So I look forward to discussing in the Q&A going forward. So my name is Imani Mosley, and I am a public musicologist. It sounds more like an admission of guilt than a declaration of self, and perhaps that is because even after all of these years of work, I still wrestle with that title. Public musicologist, public historian, and public intellectual feels like a cloak that was put on me rather than a mantle that I initially took up. But I know that that's not quite the case. My scholarship lives in the public and my appeals are to the public. Both of these things operating very differently than the work I do inside academia for academia, at least according to them. The turn for me was almost inevitable. I have always been a child of social media and public writing. I've essayed and blogged for as long as I can remember, and there has always been a compulsion within me to write in an accessible space. This was not something that was rooted in my scholarship, though that would come later. Perhaps this stemmed from my initial desire to be a journalist first and then an essayist. Before I even knew what musicology was, my models were those who wrote and spoke to the people. Maybe I'd be a satirist commenting on the shared human experience. I'd like to think that I was witty enough to do that, but the jury's still out on that, or to follow in the lineage of those involved in Black intellectual thought who I grew up reading. This was always the desire. I don't think most kids grow up thinking about writing their memoirs. I did. So the internal foundation had already been laid. When I started college, I was a music performance major with a minor in communications, determined to have some kind of public voice. And then one of my professors said, Imani, I think you were meant to be a musicologist. And I shifted my trajectory in that very moment. And it was then when I began to settle within myself as a scholar that I was able to reorient that initial foundation. So I had no idea really what musicology entailed. I knew I wanted to write in some way. I knew that I was initially thinking about being a historian and about being a journalist. And then when I was introduced to musicology, I saw a way to do all of these things together. In 2006, on my birthday, no less, Twitter was made public. A few months later, I joined the site as an early adopter of a kind, knowing that there was a potential in this platform to reach out in a way that was new and possibly revolutionary. It took a few years, but communities on Twitter began to emerge, and I found myself at the forefront of discussions around art, music, popular music, and culture. And while I've written for more traditional media, such as the New York Times, the place where people most interact with my work is on social media. As of today, right now, when I last checked, I am 10 people short of 7,000 followers on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter and you're interested in following me, please follow me at Imani Mosley. I write essays on Medium, as well as my own collection of essays, Soft Power. I also run a fairly successful blog, Humanist in the Machine, on my website that deals with issues of music technology and the future, a space that emerged from my work at NPR. I couldn't give up that dream of working in a public journalistic space. And so I worked at NPR for a time. And it is through those platforms that I segue into more traditional writing and speaking, including newspapers, talks, program notes, and more. I spend a lot of time curating my social media presence and my brand as a thinker, something that the pithiness of microblogging is very good at if you use it judiciously. And while all that explains a certain element of the term public, it doesn't really get to the heart of what my scholarship looks like as a, quote, public musicologist, public historian, public intellectual. In the mid-2010s, I noticed a change in the way people were talking about music specifically, but about everything in general. In 2015, the American Musicological Society, musicology's premier academic organization, experienced what happens when scholarly conversations enter into the, quote, marketplace of ideas. An article for AMS's front-facing public scholarship space, Musicology Now, ignited a firestorm around discussions of race, art, music, and musicology writ large. But something different also happened. Social media and news organizations, specifically right-wing news organizations, got a hold of the story. And as a result, the conversation turned into an even larger problem, unmanageable and out of our hands. In that moment, I wrote an essay that I intended to be a response to the initial article that, for safety's sake, I was in grad school. I had just become ABD, so I felt a certain amount of precarity around public-facing writing as a young junior Black queer scholar that I couldn't publish. If you're interested in reading it, you can find snippets of it in William Chang's book, Loving Music Till It Hurts, that came out in 2020. And it was in that moment that I realized that this was part of the job now, at least for me, to write in a way that expanded upon these conversations, these intersections of music and the world that were having real world implications. And as a result, I never stopped writing. It does help that the foci of my scholarship are quite timely. I work on British music, modernism, and masculinity after 1945, which is resurging in the age of Brexit, working as an opera scholar, as opera currently deals with issues around racism, sexual abuse, and mediation, and working on protest music in the age of Black Lives Matter, as Black men and women continue to be murdered by the American police state. For me, this is the real meaning behind the term public musicologist. It's not just about writing for a lay audience or having your work be disseminated in non-traditional areas. I like what Robin said about reframing the word and recontextualizing the word public. And so I would add to thinking about it also as being publicly supported in addition to public facing, but also engaging in kind of a public consciousness. It's about contributing to the intellectual life of the society we currently inhabit. It's about giving meaning and context to these moments and issues in a way that humanists, I feel, are best suited to do. As many of us see the symbols of our scholarship used for nefarious ends, I feel we have no choice but to do this kind of work. And this is not an easy task, and not everyone can do it. For the last 10 years, most notably in the last 6 or so, I have received on social media threats of violence, threats against my life, threats to try to end my career, both digitally and physically. Last year, I received quite a bit of physical hate mail, which was a really interesting experience. Because I'm committed to revealing the sometimes problematic interconnections of music, culture, and politics. I know I get the worst of it as far as my field is concerned, but I also know that were I a medievalist or classicist, that it would be almost untenable. But this work that so many brilliant thinkers are doing on social media, like everyone here today, I might add, is vital. A remark that is often made on Twitter, or that's made often, is that, quote, Twitter is not the real world, it's not real life. And in many ways, that's deeply true. Social media can be an echo chamber or a space defined by the narrowest of perspectives. But also, social media is the world, not the town square that it purports to be, especially by those occupying a libertarian-minded space, but that it is what the word public has always meant to encompass. I go to meet the people there, and sometimes they listen. But this is the future, and I am ready to embrace it, mantle and all. Thanks, everybody. I look forward to our Q&A.
Imai, thanks so much. That was excellent. I love the framing of public musicology and public musicologists kind of right off the bat. I literally, weeks ago, I think I wrote public music theory for the very first time, and I put it in a blog post that came out in Realm maybe almost a month ago. And when I first wrote it, I had it in scare quotes. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, should that be in scare quotes? I mean, public music theory just looks so strange.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I'm like, well, hang on. I mean, it's a blog. I was asked to write it. And, I have some public presence as a music theorist. And that's exactly right. And musicology just has a little longer history for those who might not know on the call of engaging with the public. Music theory, which I'm a music theorist, it has a much shorter history. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit. Thank you so much. So let's invite our last speaker, Margaret, if she can join us. And hi, Margaret, and a brief introduction for you. Margaret O'Mara is the Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington, way across the country from where I am in New York, and she is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. So I'm a daily reader of the New York Times, and therefore I'm a constant reader of Margaret's work on tech writing and very interesting perspectives about history of the United States generally, and then specifically about Silicon Valley and issues like that. So interested to hear from you today. Thank you so much for being here, Margaret. I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil, and everybody for having me here. It's really great. One advantage of our pandemic times is that I'm able to Zoom into you from sunny Seattle. It's sunny here today, so we're all very happy about that. So what amazing remarks, and it's hard there. I've got some hard acts to follow, but I also have an advantage in that you've given me so much food for thought that I've been ruminating on as I in my, thinking about my remarks. I wanted to start with my story. Phil, you kind of posed the question of kind of explaining how we got into what we were doing, or when we turned to public scholarship. And I actually was public before I was an academic. I started my career in Washington, D.C. I graduated from college in 1992. Like any self-respecting humanities major, I wasn't immediately employed. So I went back to my childhood bedroom to figure out what I was going to do next. And that childhood bedroom happened to be in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the governor was running for president. So I just stumbled into history. When you're young and you go to work on a presidential campaign, which I ended up doing, it can go one of two ways. They can win or they can lose. And if they win, everything goes in a different trajectory. Long story short, I spent the first 5 years of my working life as a political appointee in the Clinton administration. Low level, I was, Washington runs on very young people, and I was one of those very young people. But I call it my first graduate school. I saw power up close. I understood, the human beings who were in extraordinarily powerful positions, trying to do what they thought was right, making mistakes on the regular, but also understanding not only how, in the room where it happened, so to speak, certainly on the periphery of the room, not making any decisions, but also understanding and appreciating how institutions worked. How they worked to replicate privilege, how they worked to how they worked to elevate others, how so much of what was in the news cycle was only part of the story. It got me curious. One of the things one does when you're working in policy is you become a hyper specialist in certain things. And I ended up working on social policy. I was at the White House and I was at HHS, and I also did some work with HUD and some of the other domestic agencies. And I became very well versed on certain programs as they existed in the 1990s, and knew next to nothing about the history of them. And in part because life in the policy world is so reactive. Anyone who's on the webinar and has worked in that world, it's either the business world or the world of public policy. You're constantly going from one crisis to another. Certainly, if you're working in the first term of the Clinton administration, there were plenty of crises to play around with, but there was never time to think. And there was never time to look back and say, how does this fit into a broader picture? How can I understand what the historical foundations of these, what the roots are of this, how history is informing the right now? And not only was I, and as a 20-something, not really understanding the longer history of community development block grants and AFDC and Medicare and Medicaid, and kind of a granular way beyond the kind of surface immediacy of the structures of the programs as they stood then. A lot of the people with whom I worked, who were very extraordinarily knowledgeable, didn't really have the time to understand that either. And meanwhile, there were plenty of the academic voices that were in the room were social scientists that were not historians and were generally not humanists. There were plenty of economists. There were political scientists. And so I decided to do this rather strange thing and do what very few of the young people who populate Washington, D.C. tend to do when they go to graduate school. They go to the Kennedy School or they go to law school. I didn't want to do either of those. I decided I was going to get my PhD in history. And it was maybe a little bit because the only history PhD in public life at that point was Newt Gingrich, and that just annoyed me. So I figured there needed to be another historian there speaking truth to power. So thus I went to graduate school. And I went to graduate school thinking, well, I'm going to go get my PhD in history. Then I'm going to march back down to Washington and, work at a think tank and do this, that, and the other. And then and now I was imagining a job that then and now does not exist. I was seeing myself in this very applied frame. And what got into my PhD program, I was at Penn working under the late Michael Katz, and and it was, which was a wonderful, marvelous experience as a graduate student. The whole program, it was just extraordinary. But I sort of sitting my first semester in my historiography seminar, it's like, oh God, I'm being trained to be a professor. and all the public writing I had ideas about doing, and all of the things I had in my head of writing policy papers and thinking about practicing history in public was not gelling. And at the same time, there was I was encountering this extraordinary scholarship for the first time, which was so wonderful. I finally had time to slow down and to be proactive rather than reactive, to write my own stuff instead of writing someone else's speeches or briefing books, to get out of the perpetual spin cycle crisis mode of Washington policymaking and move back and think about the long view and take time. But I also saw around me that there was very little, particularly in the discipline of history at that time, this is 1997 when I entered graduate school, very little back and forth between the public and the academic, and that the academic, the public writing I was doing, or the more applied public policy work I was doing, the op-eds that I was trying to write, there wasn't blogging yet, but the kind of proto-public work, the interdisciplinary social scientific work, applied public policy work, for a long time, I didn't put some of that, a good deal of that on my CV, my academic CV. It didn't seem relevant. And as a junior scholar, I felt that it would work against me. And how different things are now. So I think that what we're dealing with now is a very different landscape, a landscape that has been that is a consequence of crisis in the humanities, the cratering of the job market in history, among other disciplines, particularly American history. So you have a lot of really extraordinary graduate students and junior scholars who are, as Robin put it, into the side hustle, or maybe making that their central hustle because there is no choice. So there's a porosity between the academia and the public that wasn't there before, partially because of things that they're nothing we should celebrate at all. This diminution of the humanities, this the neoliberal university. The other thing is that there's been the rise of the internet, and there's now this just fire hose of information and a hunger for content. And so as I ended up not being the public historian I thought I was going to be, and sort of stumbled again, very fortunately, into academic postdoc, and then an academic appointment, and then a tenure track and tenure job, which gave me, gave me the privilege to do this public work that I had originally intended to do. So I think one of the things that shapes my ability to what I do is that I think I had a bit of an advantage in having worked in that my pre-academic life, having this exposure to policy and policymaking and understanding the kind of rhythms of that world actually first has not only informed the questions I ask as a scholar, the interaction between states and markets that I explore in my work on the technology and industry and everything else, was rooted in my firsthand experience in the early 90s in Washington. But it also is, I think that I've very consciously tried since kind of achieving, I did have to foreground my academic work first. And I think this is something that maybe we can talk about more in the Q&A, about the question of stability and privilege, and what sort of, I'm able to do what I do because I have my day job, and I have this rock solid, I have something at the core, and I'm able to riff on it. I'm able to do, to write in a whole host of venues because I have done the academic writing already, and it gave me the launching pad. And so I think the challenge is that, the opportunities are now, we no longer have the wall that so frustrated me in the late 90s when I entered graduate school, and was like, there are all these brilliant people, all these brilliant intellectuals, and they don't see themselves as public intellectuals. And particularly, many of them see that as, you're being a popularizer. You're not, that's not the work. You need to focus on this type of publishing only and this type of teaching only, and not seeing teaching as public scholarship, which I see it very much as. I see all of what I do as connected and thinking about all these things together. But I think we now have a new environment which we should seize and embrace and reckon with. I think there's a couple of challenges that I want to leave us with. One is that the beauty of scholarship is the slowness. What I experienced when I left the fast-paced world of policy to the world of academia. That slow scholarship also, is a mismatch to the fast news cycle and the demand for hot takes, and being, very much online, and being, Twitter is very fast moving, and other venues are very fast moving. And an editor wants you to write an op-ed, in a couple of days. And you're like, well, I think I really need to think about this. This is about, bigger questions of political economy. Like that doesn't go. So there's a challenge there. And I think that especially for book disciplines, the humanities are book disciplines, and we are, devolving down into shorter form. And I think that there's the other big honking challenge is that of economic precarity. Being extremely online does not extremely compensate you. Creating one's own, but I agree with Robin, like even with, and I am very, very grateful for the job I have, but I also, my side hustles, book writing, speaking, other things. I do sort of very deliberately put myself in rooms where historians don't usually go, in part because I think business audiences and goodness knows Silicon Valley companies need to hear a historian talk to them and a humanist talk to them and understand where they're coming from, or explain where they are and how they got there. But that is, and I'm absolutely I'm so extraordinarily privileged. And when I think about all these extraordinary scholars who are cobbling together careers in academia, outside, straddling them, and this is happening at the same time that journalism is cratering, as well as, the economic models of both. So I'd really love to open, as I talk with my fellow panelists, sort of think about these challenges that come with the extraordinary opportunity of being able to, an obligation we have to bring our voices to the public. Thanks.
Margaret, thank you. That was great. And yes, let's, if we could, come back on, all panelists, and move to the second part of our discussion today. I should have been saying, I wrote it down here and I never did it, but I should have been saying to everybody, please ask questions in the Q&A. So for later on, for maybe 25 minutes from now, let's say, we'll take some questions from the audience, but you can still please do that. And now I'd like to just have a conversation with the six of us here. And I did say earlier to maybe begin with any one of you, but I'm going to take that away and I'm going to start. Because I thought it would be actually quite appropriate to start with by asking John, because he is from Minnesota, and one of the episodes of Seeing White was about the whole idea of the South as being particularly racist, and the northern Minnesotans thinking, oh, that's so horrible that you're from the South because it's racist down there, and we're not, right? Now I can say that also because I'm also a corn-fed Midwesterner like John. I'm from Northern Illinois, cornfields as far as the eye can see. And that is ridiculous. And now we're seeing in Minnesota with the killing of Daunte Wright just days ago in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, the trial of Derek Chauvin. So I thought I would ask John first. Well, maybe a two-part thing so that when we can hear from John and then segue into a little bit of a larger conversation. So John, I guess I would just ask you, to reflect a little bit on Minnesota and what's happening recently, because it's like happening today and tomorrow and Monday. Verdict's going to come in soon with Derek Chauvin. To talk a little bit about the aspect of being a Midwesterner, being white Midwestern who understands how race has developed in a very intimate way. And then maybe the second part of that can segue, and we can start with John, and I'd love to hear from everybody, Jesse in particular, about how the current environment of our print, pod media, social media obviously that has played into this rise of violence that we're witnessing, anti-Asian violence, obviously anti-Black violence, but just kind of general hate and misogyny and anti-Semitism and all these things, how that's played into it. And is it, are there clear dots to draw? I'm sure Jesse could do that for us. And we all could do that. So maybe those 2 points to begin with, and let's just kind of open it up and have an open conversation here with the 6 of us.
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is just that my heart aches and my heart breaks. Not as a Minnesotan, but as a human being, with what's happening and just the day after day and the incident after incident and murder after murder, and yes, and the fact that that we have in Minnesota, the Daunte Wright killing and the Chauvin George Floyd killing and Philando Castile, and I think that there is a time in my life, and that's what I was getting at in a couple of those episodes in Seeing White. There is a time in my life when I would have, a few decades ago, when I would have been really surprised and taken aback and thought, and maybe said that thing where this isn't us, and it would have been an eye-opening thing, because I grew up with this idea, as you said, that racism was a distinctly Southern problem, and that we were relatively innocent. And I'm long over that. But I mean, and when I talk about this thing, sorry, someone's phone is going across the room. I don't know if you can hear that, but what I often say to people, and actually this is one of the quotes from Shannon Sullivan, who I showed the photo of earlier. She talks about almost more of a cultural or a kind of social difference that's distinctive about the way that white supremacy presents itself in the South and the North. And obviously there is a history in terms of slavery having lasted much longer, and Jim Crow, and et cetera. But if you look at the real systemic expressions of racism, housing segregation, employment discrimination, the way that we have deeply racialized inequities in their schools and criminal justice system, those things are pretty much the same all over the country, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, John.
Yeah, no, please.
And so then, thank you. Is there a way that we can kind of draw the lines from our current media environment, which is just, there's so many moving parts. It's kind of really hard to get your mind wrapped around it. Like, to what extent is the rise in violence, the rise in white supremacy, is it a result of our changing media landscape? I mean, you're all experts more than I am in this. And I'm wondering, how we can maybe speak about it, what terms we can use, and obviously we're all going to ask ourselves what we can do about it. That's kind of a stock question. But even beyond that general stock question, I want to understand how it's actually gotten to this point and what role the media has played. Can I start with Jesse?
Oh, hey, yeah, sure. I have so many thoughts on this, it's hard to know where to start. And I was actually going to defer to Margaret, because she's probably closer on the ground than this about this, but we can maybe go back and forth. So I'm actually working on a book right now called Tweetstorm, that's about the rise of the far right. And I was just thinking this morning that it's got a long subtitle that I don't think works yet, but the subtitle is something like how tech and media created the mainstreaming of white supremacy and what we can do about it. But I was thinking, the better subtitle might be how we went from a Black president, the first Black president, to a white mob at the Capitol, in the span of 2008 to 2021. Like, how did that happen? Yeah. And I think, for me, part of the explanation is the media ecosystem, to call it that. So it's not just the internet, because and it's not just social media, but there's something else going on with the connection to Fox News and the cable stations, and sort of how those, and again, like Margaret was saying, and the fact that journalism is collapsing. So we have we have that going away. We have the rise of things like Fox News, and then we have kind of this swirl machine of social media that speeds it all up and amplifies it, and then it gets regurgitated on Fox News. So there's something else. I'm still obviously struggling with what to name this new thing, but there is something going on. Of course, it's not, communication scholars would urge us not to make a media effects argument where it's just the media and the technology that's making the difference. There's something real happened when Barack Obama was elected the first Black president. And as much as people celebrated, and if you go back and look at the mainstream news reports at the time, there was a lot of ink spilled talking about how we were now post-racial. I mean, people were really saying that with a straight face in 2008. And the thing that also happened the night that President Obama was elected is that the servers, the computer servers at Stormfront crashed because so many angry white people were going to Stormfront that night. So it's both and, there's something real about what the media ecosystem is creating in the material world, but the material world also still matters, not only the sort of highs of things like Barack Obama being elected, but the terrible, terrible lows of the continuous, let's call them what they are, lynchings of Black people that are now, circulating on media. Jenna Wortham, also at the New York Times, I thought had the best take on this about George Floyd, because I kept thinking when the Floyd video, which let's remember was recorded by a 17-year-old Black girl, and I think about her every day, and what that did to her, sorry. Yeah, I mean, there's something happening in the material world that then gets circulated in social media. And Jenna Wortham said the difference between, say, Eric Garner, which those of us who live in New York watched that man be killed with a chokehold on a sidewalk in Staten Island over and over and over again on local news. Like, why didn't that become the national cause? And George Floyd did. Well, I think Jenna Wortham called it. She said, we're all inside. We're all watching the TV, because of the pandemic. And that had a kind of galvanizing effect. So I think it's both, and it's all these things at once, and I'm right in the middle of trying to figure it out. I'm sure somebody else on this panel has got a better answer than I do.
Thank you, Jesse. I always, as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself that we're trying to find reasons, and sometimes it seems like they might be excuses.
Yeah.
And it might be that, let's blame the internet, right?
Right.
For what this is, rather than just looking at ourselves and saying, let's blame our white supremacist patriarchy. And then finally have a reckoning therewith, right? That's a really important aspect that just doesn't get said enough. Let us blame our patriarchal white supremacy in the history of the country and no longer put it under the rug. Margaret, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm in the yes and camp. As someone who's thinking a lot about what has social media done, and I think this media is different than other new media of earlier eras, whether it be print culture of the 19th century or tabloid newspapers and television, in that it's algorithmically amplified and everyone's the blind man and the elephant, right? So we all are getting these incomplete, and also it is designed, the way that you engage people online and keep them clicking is you enrage them or inflame their emotions. I mean, you can inflame their emotions with, cute puppies. That's one way, but more reliable is enragement. And that's something that the Trump campaign and others really cottoned onto in 2016 and rode that, continue to ride that. I'm just struck by thinking about this again, I think is just this week. This was not planned, but my students I'm teaching a course on 1968. And my students read part of Elizabeth Hinton's book, From the War on Crime to the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, which really kind of quite powerfully shows that, thinking about this shift from, first of all, the war on poverty was given about, 18 months of oxygen before everyone was like, well, let's just give money to law enforcement. It's law and order. Mm-hmm. And seeing the intrusion of, the sort of turning over social services to law enforcement, which of course accelerates dramatically in the Nixon administration. But it's just it's a understand, we need to both recognize that the current environment, why is social media such a volatile stew partially because of institutional failure, structural racism, all these things that have not been reckoned with before. And people are turning to QAnon because, among other things, both major parties have been promising all sorts of things to white working class people for 30 years and that they haven't been able to deliver. That's one, that doesn't excuse it, but it helps explain it. So all these things are, and I think this is where a humanistic perspective, which is where the answer is often it's complicated, which is a super bad soundbite, and cable news hates it. But I think continuing to foreground this, it's complicated, and doing it in a way, in a language that is not talking down to people, but is explaining to people about this complexity and contingency is absolutely essential if you're actually going to move towards something, where things need to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Did anyone else want to jump in there? Yeah, Imani.
Yeah, so this is something that I've been working on and writing on a bit about in the last, I guess, 6 months or so, after my chapter on Black Lives Matter and protest music came out, and I've been expanding this discussion because unfortunately the topic continues to be timely, and something that I have sort of honed in on when thinking about social media and media writ large in this particular conversation is about the sort of act of witnessing. That witnessing has always been a part of this this sort of supremacist structure, the ability to kind of witness and engage in and take pleasure from death and murder, about a sort of moment of kind of a white jouissance in the witnessing of Black death. And what makes this moment really particular, and I think amplifies this in a way, is that now we're in the age of unintentional and intentional witnessing. So I am up very late at night a lot, super late, sometimes late enough to kind of sort of be on when sort of British Twitter comes on, which is kind of a thing for me since my work takes place in the UK, and so sometimes that's purposeful. And so as a result, I end up sometimes seeing news stories that break really late in the night or are breaking in other parts of the world while Americans are mostly asleep. And one of the things that I remember was seeing the Facebook live streaming of the Christchurch shooting. Mm-hmm. And that I immediately got onto my social media and said, if you are awake right now and you are on social media, like, please log off. Because on Facebook and on Twitter, there is the streaming of a mass shooting happening in New Zealand right now. And that I was not searching for, anything in particular, that I was just doing my regular kind of internet scrolling and was bombarded with this media. And so we're at a place now where if you wanted to know about what was happening about a subject, you had to wait until the news told you about it. And now not only can you search for that yourself, but sometimes it happens to you. That kind of moment happens to you without your knowledge. I think something that's happened very recently, as the video of the murder of Adam Toledo came out the other day, that one thing that I saw on Twitter a lot was, here's how you turn autoplay off on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Go to your settings and do this. Useful. Because a thing that many people haven't really thought about now becomes this moment of unintentional witnessing and harm, because Twitter is just, you're like, oh, you're scrolling and you want to, someone posts a video and it just plays. And now part of our praxis is we have to tell people about how to turn that off, to stop that from happening, so that way you don't watch the body cam footage of the police murder a child, right? And so yes to what everyone is saying about yes and it's complicated, but I think there is a really specific aspect about social media now in the last 10 years that does exacerbate this problem in a way that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, that's a great point, because we all do some doom scrolling now and then. And it just never even occurred to me. I did watch one. It didn't get violent, happily, and no one died, but there was an incident somewhere where a very large white man was threatening a Black youth who was half his size. And I didn't really need to see that. So thank you for that. I'm actually going to do that right as we pivot here. I see Robin has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to jump in and kind of build off what everyone, but especially what Imani was saying, because I was reminded this week that this week is the 20th anniversary of the Timothy Thomas shooting in Cincinnati. I'm from Cincinnati, so I remember that. And I think what I would say is that there was no video of that. So I think pointing to how different media ecologies sort of force evolutions in white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, right? Because I really want to push back against the idea that something has gotten worse. I think it's changing, right? Because white supremacy was not better 20 years ago when they shot Timothy Thomas, right? But I think what we're seeing is the media environment is forcing white supremacy to optimize itself in different ways and in new ways.
That's a great point. I want to follow up, Robin, with you and just say, do you think, yes, I completely agree with what you just said. And yet, do you think that somehow with the scrolling, the doom scrolling and the autoplay videos, has it somehow gotten turbocharged such that they're, that white nationalists have come together on various platforms, and the grievance is so high, it's so visible, they get sucked in, and the white supremacy has always been there. No one's going to deny that. But it almost feels like it has been somewhat turbocharged, or has it always been like that, and now we just see it because we all can see things a lot better? What do you think, Robin?
I think I tend to agree with Sarah Bannett-Weiser here, right? She has this book, Empowered, which talks about how social media has made both left voices and right voices more spectacular and sort of amplified them both. And so I tend to think that your racist uncle was always your racist uncle at, Thanksgiving or whatever. And he just thought those things, but didn't necessarily say them because he didn't feel empowered to say them, or that it was socially acceptable to say them. So I think one of the things that has happened is the spectacularness of both left views and right views have been amplified, right? So I noticed, this must have been around 2015. So I've been teaching courses in feminist philosophy since 2001. At community colleges, state schools, right? But in 2015, students came into the class sort of already knowing what intersectionality was, right? Sort of already they already knew who bell hooks was, right? And I think Alison McCracken at DePaul has done some work on Tumblr, right? And how sort of various forms of social media have moved the awareness of progressive and left ideas forward, just as it has moved awareness and popularity of right ideas forward. So I think what we're witnessing is an evolution of ongoing systems, and it might feel worse because it's changing the way we perceive them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. It's when we could go on with this topic, I think, for quite a while. It's it's extremely important. And it is also, of course, can be extremely depressing. And I have to say that I myself have, so I'm in music theory, I think and yes, there was a controversy last summer, and that's how I got pulled in to the idea of cancel culture vortex. And I use the words white supremacy and patriarchy quite freely, and that kind of puts you on the radar of this whole ecosystem of hate, and so I've been on that, and I can do that. I've also been heartened by by far and away, I get way more positive feedback saying thank you for X, thank you for Y, thank you for Z, for doing this, for saying that, for writing something else. So there's that too, and one, we should all have kind of a group nod that there's a lot of really good stuff going on. But when you think about what's happening right now in Minnesota, and just this drip, drip, drip. I think Imani said something like, you're writing about Black topics, and unfortunately, you're always going to have more material, right? That's just kind of where we are. But that hate was always there, and it is by far and away not only Blacks who are on the receiving end of white supremacist patriarchal hate, which historically has been the story of the United States to a significant extent, not to the complete extent. Of course, there are other things here as well, but it's important to just note that that's part of our history. And it is good to know, let's end on a little hopeful note here, as I'm going to pivot now to some questions from the audience. It is good to know that we can now have open discussions about some of these things, whereas it was much more difficult before, some years ago. Michael Powell did a piece in the New York Times last September or October about the use of the term white supremacy in the New York Times. And he said that in 2010, it was used something like 70 times in the entire year. And then back in September of 2020, maybe it was October, that article came out. He said it's been used over 700 times and the year hadn't ended yet. Meaning that, like it or, I mean, white structures really don't like to talk about whiteness, right? I think we all know that. That's something that they really are very committed to taking the focus off of whiteness however they possibly can. Deflection, denialism, right? It's part of the picture here. And just the idea that it is becoming the concept of critical whiteness, right? Something that people would have had a heart attack hearing that, which is more, like Scandinavia has a pretty well-defined concept of critical whiteness that they think about in their scholarship over there far more than we do. But we have it now too. And it's okay. Yes, you're going to get all the hate. You will have that hate. And, you have to accept that if you're going to go into it. If you're going to speak in clear, unfettered language, that's going to happen. But, we have institutions that can hopefully protect us and stand behind us. Sometimes they do a better job than I see Jesse's eyebrows, one up and one down right there. I'll just leave it at that. But we can, of course, we can and must protect ourselves and make sure that we know how to do that. So let's pivot to some questions. Okay, I have some in my chat here. My colleague Matt Lasner is feeding me some stuff. So this seems to be a general question for anybody. So here I go. Yes, everybody who's been listening, thanks for indulging us, and I hope you've enjoyed everything so far. Now I'll pivot to some of the questions that have come in. Has the emergence of public academic discourse been conducive to the thoughtful, rational pursuit of knowledge and truth? If someone has thoughts on a scholarly book or article, rather than writing a book review or submitting an original article engaging the issue at hand, they might now just post a few breezy or snarky comments. What happens as you transform the forms of understanding and interpretation and language found in books? What are the costs? Does anybody want to jump in?
I'll jump in.
Sure, Robin.
Most of my social media stuff eventually becomes my books, right? Mm-hmm. So this is just like the first draft form, right? And that's kind of explicitly part of my blogging practice, right? Oh, I have an idea, or I just read this great book or this terrible book, or, let me get my thoughts out. And that sort of is the very first step in the pipeline of my scholarly work. So I wouldn't necessarily see these two as exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think about throwing out a blog post. It's something like a trial balloon. You kind of see what sticks. And, it's also good if reading comments can get a little messy, right? If you've actually said something, yeah, right. Don't read the comments. That's my general rule of thumb, is just don't. I remember somebody got into so up on my website, I have cello links, like I play cello and I have recordings, and some really mean person was really convinced that, oh, this person's a really horrible cellist. Just look at this recording at 3 minutes and 25 seconds and listen how they missed that B flat. I'm like, oh my goodness. I thanks for listening, I guess. You really had to do like if it took you that long
to trolling.
Right. If you took it that long to find one wrong note, I'm a better cellist than I thought I was. But the blogs and the general ideas, even something like a Twitter project, if it's more than just a 280 character thing. I did a Twitter project for Black History Month where every morning I sent out a tweet of a Black musician or composer or music theorist who's just been erased from history, because that's what my field, music theory, has done. And that is going to be part of an academic work.
Can I just
Yeah,
jump in
please.
on that one too?
Jesse, yeah.
I did a post, I don't know, years ago about taking something from a tweet to a blog post, to a series of blog posts, to a peer-reviewed article. And I've done the same with books. I mean, I think that it's very similar to what Robin's talking about. It's like for the first draft, but I also think that there's something, one of the pushbacks from traditionally trained academics is, what about peer review? And to me, some of my readers who are outside the academy are the best peer reviewers, people with lived experience of whatever it is I'm talking about are the first people that I want to talk to. And those are often people who are not going to be going through the traditional peer review process at a journal. So I think it's improved my scholarship for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And since you mentioned peer review, Margaret, just one second, and I'm going to come to you. I'd like to put out there the whole concept of peer review. You all know Kate Manne and her beautiful work on exposing male privilege, and how she breaks down sexism as the justification for patriarchy, but misogyny as the policing and enforcing mechanisms for patriarchy, right? So peer review, I often talk about academic peer review as the gold standard for policing and enforcing whiteness and maleness. That's what I think of as academic peer review. That's the gold standard, right? That's how whiteness and maleness can ultimately weed out that work and say, nope, can't publish that here because it's challenging our authority. Of course, you're never going to really get that straight argument. But what you just said, like starting something as a tweet, an idea, really just kind of growing into something that can be academic and peer reviewed, but it could easily meet that final fate, which is we're not going to let this get out because we don't like how it challenges us and our authority. So it's a very difficult path to follow there. Anyway, Margaret, you had a comment.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on peer review, I think that there's an opportunity to, avenues that make peer review more inclusive and iterative and open up new voices are something to be embraced, and to not, but having, I think it does point to having the collective, having feedback and iteration in everything we do. I'm like Robin. I do my public writing is me testing out ideas. My New York Times pieces are both kind of distillations of academic work I've done, and also ways of pursuing ideas that I'm thinking about. And it's forcing me also to because with help from good editors, to sort of present them in very clear, accessible, walk a large audience through an idea. The other thing that that public work has made me braver about doing, we're all specialists, right? So academic training makes us specialists, and you have your specialty, and you really don't want to get out over your skis or tread on other people's toes, to sort of double metaphor there. And, well, I can't write about the 19th century because I'm not a Gilded Age historian. I'm a 20th century historian. Well, the last year I wrote a piece about tariffs and trade wars, things that I teach about in the survey, but I've never written about. And that I had to, so I decided, well, this actually, I'll use historiography and I'll credit others. And so what I've tried to do is both use scholarly work to inform my public work, either my own work or theirs. And then also tried especially when I've drawn on a lot of other people's work, to do Twitter threads that are kind of reading lists of, if you'd like to learn more about this, like here's the literature on trade unionism in Detroit, here's all this marvelous work. So I think there are ways to do it, but the thing that I think is a challenge for me, and I don't know about all of you, is that I've particularly this last year, I've gravitated towards short form because our world has exploded and our attention span has exploded, and we live through screens. And I worry a lot about not only our sustained attention span of the reader to grapple with book length, the monograph, and grappling through sort of slow ideas, big ideas, long form ideas, and also us as scholars to produce long form and stick with these long patient projects. I think that's another place, to the sort of going back to the internet, where the internet has just kind of blown our brains apart. And it's very difficult to have the sustained focus in the practice that we once had.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to do another question here. And so Matt's feeding me in the chat, so I don't have the names of the questioners. I apologize for that. This questioner says, Professor James so powerfully said, quote, being a woman online is like being a woman in philosophy, close quote. Could the panel expand on the parallels of gendered subjugation in academia and online? Who wants to start that off? I know you have ideas. Go ahead, John.
I'll say something, and the brief thing that I will say is that I am keenly aware that as a middle-aged white cis het male, I take vastly less shit for saying things, similar things to what Black and Indigenous and brown and feminist women say, for example, on social media. I get, yes, and having done the podcast series that I talked about, I get some trolling. I get people who say, you're one of the, it's mostly kind of right-wing, white men saying, you're one of those libs that's trying to apologize for being a white male, screw you kind of thing. And I get some of that, but the volume and the vehemence and the death threats, and I really don't get very much of that at all.
But I had an
now,
idea.
I'm afraid, maybe the right people haven't yet found me, but yes, I do notice a big difference.
I had a few ideas too, and then I thought to myself, well, hang on, there are two cis men on this call right now, and the question is about being a woman. So I would really love to hear. The quote was from Robin. So I'm sorry, we're all using first names. I should have said that up front, that's totally fine. And I because this questioner says Professor or Dr. James or something. So at any rate, yes, Robin.
So this is more, I guess, strategy, right? So I'm in philosophy. My work is marginally legible as philosophy to philosophers, but I find the people who I want to be around. And I think this is very analogous to my liberal block policy on Twitter, right? I am not interested in wasting my time defending myself and defending my work against people who I will never convince to take me seriously in the first place, right? I do that in my sort of online existence, and I do that in my scholarly existence as well. There is an academic subfield of the philosophy of music, but I have no interaction with it at all, right? In large part because my background is in feminist philosophy and the critical philosophy of race. And I once walked out of a meeting of the American Society for Aesthetics when Peter Kivy was giving a keynote lecture and started saying, I can't believe why we would even need to talk about Beethoven's race. And I just stood up and walked out, right? Because this is not the kind of question that's helpful for my work or that moves my work forward. And I would rather spend my time and energy conversing with people who are on the same page that I am, rather than just try to, constantly defend my work against people who really don't care about my work and are really just interested in putting me in my place. And I think they're very similar dynamics to my online existence.
Looks like Phil
left,
dropped out, or maybe he
Yes,
lost his internet.
Maybe he lost his connection.
Hi everyone.
Can I just jump in on that
I
question?
think we should just keep going.
Please keep talking.
Yeah.
Phil will be back shortly. His son cut the internet on accident.
I figured. Oh, there he is. We're so glad you're back, Phil.
We missed you.
I was going to echo Robin's great comments about that. And I think there are ways in which, it's such a great observation, right? Being a woman on the internet is like being a woman in philosophy. Do bumper stickers or t-shirts or coffee cups or something so that we can all get those. But I just actually finished working on a book called Nice White Ladies, about the particular role that white women play in perpetuating white supremacy and how we can disrupt that or divest from whiteness. And I just want to say that I appreciate the question about what it's like to be embodied as a woman, to be identified as femme or identify as femme on the internet. And it's rough out there. But I also want to challenge the question a little bit. One of the things I talk about in Nice White Ladies is that we're our vision is curtailed if we ask gender only questions, that if we don't put race into our questions about gender, then feminism maps really easily onto white supremacy. And I know that because for the cyber racism book, I spent a lot of time in a place on Stormfront called Ladies Only. It's just for the women of white supremacy. And it sounded like a NOW meeting. It sounded like National Organization for Women. They were very for equal pay, for equal rights, for women, right? But they're really talking about white women and how they can be equal to white men. And I think that we have to expand our vision to include a very intersectional appreciation that there are lots of different experiences for women, and that, so for example, we talk about Gamergate as one of those things that hit the popular press a few years ago, where women were really set upon by these dudes who played video games and were very offended by some things that a woman journalist had said. One of the things that Black women that I admire greatly, that I know mostly through Twitter, but I've met in real life, like Saidet Harry, Shireen Mitchell, Nikki Kendall, what they all pointed out around Gamergate was, you know what, this happened like 5 years ago to Black women and no one cared. The mainstream press didn't care, people on Twitter didn't care, people in video game world didn't care. And so I think we have to be careful when we ask those questions about what it's like to be a woman, because it presumes a kind of unitary experience, right, that often defaults to white. So I just want to complicate the question a little bit.
That's such an important point, Jesse. I really, could not agree more. That's something that I find quite a bit. I mean, obviously, I'm a man. I'm a cisgender man, but I'm Black, despite the fact that my mother was from Norway. As a matter of fact, I'm mixed race, but I won't be mistaken for white ever, and that's a very significant point. And white women will never be mistaken for men, most likely, right? That's the way we're. So if we're not thinking about those two basic elements, but then of course other intersectional elements, it really does need to be problematized, like Jesse said. Margaret, I saw your hand up.
This is just a very brief add-on. I think that I've found that I'm an object of much mansplaining. I think partially because I write about political history, high politics, and technology, which are two male-dominated worlds in which I think it deeply offends a good subset of people, particularly of an earlier generation, to have a woman as an authority. But I think that my race it insulates me and what I write about, which is not pushing as many buttons. I mean, the worst thing I tell tech venture capitalists is, the government had something to do with your success, which, ticks them off, but doesn't result in worse things. So it's very important to recognize these hierarchies of social privilege that are being replicated in online space, as well as finding those survival strategies for insulating oneself from it.
Excellent. Can I do oh, sorry, Imani, did you want to say something? Please.
Just really quickly about talking about this intersection. I think there also, as Margaret points out, there is a connection to the things that we're discussing that also shapes the way these interactions take place. So I will say that when I've gotten into my most sort of viral, controversial conversations about classical music online, that my identity as a woman, or me openly identifying as a woman, has not been a part of any discussion, other than maybe the ability for people to feel that they can threaten me with violence, but it has always been centered around my Blackness, as if I, as a Black person, do not have access to or the ability to talk about a cultural product that is so rooted in whiteness. So whatever knowledge I may have is fundamentally underscored by whatever a white person says on social media about classical music, because they inherently have access to it that I don't. And so that fundamentally shifts that conversation for me, because I rarely in the discussions that I am having, in the spaces that I am in, rarely have to be concerned about people focusing on my gender that's separate from, you know, the way Black women are targeted online anyway, that I don't have an added bit to that because of what I'm talking about, because what I'm talking about is so focused on race than it is on gender. And so that complicates that issue for me. And I can see how having that conversation about those intersectional moments change regarding what it is that we're talking about. If you're occupying a space like one where you're talking about technology and politics, Margaret, like you said, that has a very sort of gendered aspect to it, then I wouldn't be surprised that you know, attacks that are gender based would kind of rise to the top, right? Where that's less the case. In my situation. And so, you know, it's just another moment of how all of these things are intermingled and work in strange ways online in various different conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point, Imani, if I could follow up, because, you know, when Margaret talks about, you know, tech and politics as being so male dominated, and that kind of is a very difficult thing for people to look at her as a woman. And there's kind of a bit of a, like, what? I don't get this, a disconnect, right? In musicology and music theory, the woman aspect is, as Imani is alluding to, less problematic than the racial aspect, right? So, and I would just follow up and say that I am African-American and I'm a cisgender man, but it's the African-Americanness that makes me, I often say that I am at once the most visible and the least visible music theorist in the United States. Well, now I'm visible because I you know, because there was some media coverage of something that I did, you know, actually back in 2019. But the invisibility is, it doesn't matter how many articles I publish, doesn't matter, you know, I won't be considered for awards, and I won't be considered just for general service. I often say that I'm on 2 editorial boards in Russia because I'm a Russianist, and my colleagues in Russia value me, and everything takes place in the Russian language. I'm a fluent Russian speaker, and including my own reviews. It's humbling when they say, Philip, would you review this article on Soviet opera? And everything happens in Russian. And I'm like, yes, I'm on the editorial board. I will do that. I'm on an editorial board in Ireland for another pop rap, because I also have a subspecialty in rap. But that would never happen in the United States. I would never be asked, even as a Russianist, to join an editorial board. It's never happened. To join a program committee for music theory, you know, those types of things are kind of off limits because people don't see me. They don't see me. My Blackness makes me invisible to the field of music theory and to musicology. And it's only when I get a write-up in the New York Times or Fox News, you know, the National Review and the New Yorker, that people will be like, wait a minute, what's happening here? There was this, where did he come from? Like, well, you know, I don't mean to make it personal. I really mean to say, this is what a Black person in music theory, for example. And I'm sure Imani could say the same thing about her Blackness in the field of musicology. Did I see your hand go up again, Imani?
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly, and to Jesse's point earlier, it was in academia where I had white women tell me that I wouldn't experience, just wait until I got into academia and got a TT job, and that was where I would experience discrimination. Because there was a kind of reverse moment, right? Where in a bid to achieve a kind of intersectionality between women, my Blackness was completely erased because they saw me as this female identifying body that they could connect with. And that was enough to kind of espouse a very particular second wave feminism that couldn't apply to me in my life in the 21st century. And so these things happen in both directions, in multiple directions all the time. And I think that is a way of connecting what happens in academia to this conversation of that we're having about what happens in these public social media spaces.
Folks, let's do one final question and then we're going to wrap up. And it's a general question, and it has to do with cancel culture. It's pretty simple. So the question, does cancel culture distort how information is received by a younger generation? Who wants to jump in with that one?
What even do we mean by cancel culture?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is cancel culture? It's a really difficult thing to pin down. Margaret, I saw you unmute.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is cancel culture? We sort of ceding the rhetorical frame to something that's being used for different ends. If anything, I see it, whatever, you know, the kind of swiftness with the swift stream of social media, the swiftness within which we operate in social media, and how quickly we kind of ricochet from one thing to another, and that someone can, you know, have a bad tweet can kind of make someone the Twitter celebrity of the day, right? And then get canceled or whatever that may be, very, very swiftly, to a degree that the human, I mean, I think it's another manifestation of how the media environment that we're operating in, the technological environment, is kind of beyond human neurological capacity to keep up, that we're just drinking from this fire hose of information. And that then again, the angriest, the loudest voices in the room come punch through, and often they're angry voices, and often it's, and of course, having to go very, very short form, especially when expressing very complex ideas that require long form expression and debate and iteration. 140, 280 characters can be so swiftly misinterpreted, can be so swiftly. And so this, you know, whatever it is, now it's manifested into, you know, kind of right-wing figures filling this, talking about how they're being canceled. But that is, I think, a symptom of this broader media environment that is troubling for the thoughtful advancement of conversations and ideas.
Yeah, if I could just follow up with maybe a final comment, and I see Jonathan is here to end our session today. That's exactly right. You know, what's cancel culture, right? You really can't define it. It's being sucked into something that you probably shouldn't be sucked into. So what I often say to students and anyone, you know, who might ask me that is just don't engage, probably, you know, step back and block people if you need to. Don't be so pulled in. Don't allow yourself to be pulled in to the vortex, because nothing good happens, you know, when you're down. You know, I'm not going to debate somebody about a B flat I may or may not have missed at 3 minutes, 25 seconds of a piece I put up online, right? And nor should you, because if that's cancel culture, well, then that's just silliness, right? I'm going to say my closing piece here before I hand it over to Jonathan, who's going to end us for today. Robin, Imani, Jesse, John, Margaret, what a great conversation. It is so nice. Jesse, I know for many years, but the rest of you I haven't met, and I really hope that we can meet in person. It has just been an absolutely delightful conversation, and I hope it's been interesting for the people on the call. So thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to the panel and to the participants.
Thanks.
Jonathan Fanton is here to end us. Thanks, everybody.
So on behalf of President Raab and the directors of the Mellon Public Humanities Program, Nico Israel and Linda Alkoff, I want to thank you, Philip, for an excellent job as our moderator. And I want to thank the panelists for a rich, robust, relevant, and revealing exploration of the evolving ecosystem of the public humanities, social media, public issues, and the health of our democracy. We've learned a lot from this thoughtful, open, and honest discussion of complex issues. For example, how the public humanities flourish on long-form podcasts to explore topics like racial and gender identity and discrimination, or how courageous blog confronting white supremacy can expose public scholars to personal risk and attacks, or how Twitter can advance the soft power of the arts and the public-facing humanities, or how we need to seize and embrace the new environment marked by a firestorm of information and a hunger for content. And finally, why we must join forces to advocate not just for the public-facing humanities, but for public support of the humanities. Over our three-part series, we're exploring how the humanities can help strengthen the democratic commons and that are so essential to our democracy. So I'd like to call your attention to the Knight Foundation program on media trust and democracy, which supports 10 centers or more around the country that are really building a new field that intersects with the topics we've been talking about. 3 examples: University of Washington Center for Informed Public, NYU, the Center for Social Media and Politics, and Indiana University's Observatory on Social Media. So check the Knight Foundation website. Finally, I want to express our gratitude to the Mellon Foundation for enabling Hunter College, its faculty and students to engage the humanities in our quest for a more just, humane, and peaceful world. I thank the audience for joining us, but I invite and encourage you to come back next Friday when we'll have a session on reckoning with monuments and public commemoration. So thank you all for coming. Have a good weekend. See you next week.